despite all of the forensic evidence recovered from the scenes of the 12 murders considered canonical by police. Along with victim 0, the Lady of the Lake, no killer was ever traced. There were in fact very few cast iron suspects at all, a fact that remains until this day over 80 years later. At the time of the murders, suspects were numerous. However, only one was ever really nailed on for any of the investigators, and even then it wasn't a unanimous line of thought. Unusually for such a historical case, this continues until today, and there is not a litany of suspects. In fact, it appears as if there were only ever really 2, and it could be argued quite easily that realistically there was only one who the leaders of the investigation believed as a serious suspect. Whether or not the suspect is particularly strong, or that the killer apparently did a very clever job of covering his tracks, is a debate that still continues. One suspect was discovered whilst investigating the death of Edward Andrassy. Police found a photo negative which, when developed, showed Andrassy on the bed in an unknown room. Police tracked down the room after publishing the photo in the local press and found it belonged to a gay man who lived with his 2 sisters. Traces of blood were found on the floor of the room, and a large butcher's knife was found stashed in a trunk. Upon further investigation, however, it turned out that the blood belonged to the suspect himself, who was prone to nosebleeds, and the knife showed no evidence of having been used in any murder. The final nail in the coffin for this line of inquiry was hammered home when police discovered the suspect had actually been in jail when victims were showing up around Kingsbury Run. This case is not uncommon in the story of the Torso murders, and numerous other stories of suspects that led nowhere are littered throughout. There were, however, some which had a little more substance. The first suspect arrested on charges of murder for the butcher killings was a man named Frank Dolezal. Dolezal in fact confessed to killing Flo Polillo. However, things with Frank were not quite as they seemed. Frank Dolezal was a 52-year-old Slav immigrant who worked as a bricklayer. He was found to have been, in general, an okay guy, but was prone to drink and at times became violent. He had drank frequently at the same bar as both Flo Polillo and Edward Andrassy. He had also lived with Flo for a couple of years. Dolezal had actually been investigated previously by Merlo, but rejected as a suspect. This time, however, the county sheriff decided, for whatever reason, that he had more promise and chose to have him arrested on the 5th of July 1939. A brown substance was found in the cracks of his bathroom floor, and it was theorised to be dried blood. He was promptly arrested, and whilst in interrogated custody, Dolezal confessed to the murder of Flo Polillo. However, his confessions lacked any great detail, and many of the obvious facts of the case, such as location and position of the body. In fact, it appeared that he didn't know much about the body at all. He later recalled his confessions, stating that they had been beaten out of him whilst he was interrogated. Before his court appearance, Frank Dolezal was found dead in his jail cell, apparently from suicide by hanging, though his autopsy showed he had broken ribs, injuries he had not suffered before his arrest. Results had returned by this point of the substance found on the bathroom floor, and as it turned out, it was not blood at all. It all appeared to have been a very ugly side of the investigation, and the police were left no closer to finding a killer than they had been before the arrest and eventual death of Frank Dolezal. Before Eliot Ness's death in 1957, he worked alongside Oscar Frehley, the man he would later collaborate with to write The Untouchables, a book detailing Ness's time fighting Capone in Chicago. Ness, however, told Frehley more than just stories about prohibition, and apparently went as far as claiming to him that he had figured out who the Mad Butcher was. He was convinced that the killer was not homeless, despite Merlot's own convictions. He believed that he had had to have owned a house, or at least been associated with a private dwelling that he could utilise to carry out the murders, as well as clean all the bodies and dismember them later. He also believed he would have needed a car to transport the body parts before distributing them around Kingsbury Run. He also firmly believed the idea that the killer was likely to be a doctor or medical man. Following these points, he had 3 agents, Virginia Allen, Barney Davis and Jim Mansky, inquire quietly among the high society of Cleveland. Alan found a man that he believed fit the bill for Ness's and the Torso Clinic's earlier profile of the killer. Ness named the man to Fraley as Gaylord Sundheim. The name itself was a nom de plume, but the facts behind the name were that he was a relatively wealthy man and a doctor with a history of psychiatric problems. Over the years, the true name of Gaylord Sundheim has been teased out and unveiled as that of one Frank Sweeney, a resident of the Kingsbury Run area, and the man that Ness firmly believed to be the killer. In March of 1938, in Sandusky, a town 65 miles west of Cleveland, a dog found the severed leg of a man. Police began a search of the area accompanied by Lieutenant David Cowles, who was interested to know whether there might be any connection with this leg to the murders in Cleveland. Cowles recalled a surgeon that they had previously tailed and who lived in the Kingsbury Run area who had fit their profile of displaying unusual behaviour. This particular man had been eliminated as a suspect at the time for his frequent stays in a Sandusky Veterans Hospice, where he would go to help with his drinking problem. His visits often overlapped with discoveries of bodies in Kingsbury Run, and therefore he appeared to have a fairly watertight alibi. However, after further inquiries, Cowles discovered that in fact, the hospital had very little in the way of security, and when patients were staying there, they were more or less free to come and go as they pleased. They had, after all, checked themselves in, and it was certainly no prison. Cowles also discovered whilst in Sandusky that the hospice shared some facilities with Ohio Penitentiary Honor Farm, and that one of the inmates there, Alex Archikai, was familiar with one of the frequent visitors to the clinic, a doctor who, in exchange for a supply of alcohol, wrote him illegal prescriptions. As it turned out, the severed leg was in fact the result of a legitimate surgery. However, Cowles had a new suspect. The doctor's name was, of course, Frank Sweeney. Francis Edward Sweeney was born in 1894, the son of poor Irish immigrants. His father was badly injured and suffered enough that he was unable to work. His mother died when he was 9 years old from a stroke. He was a veteran of World War I, where he had worked as a medic and undertaken numerous amputations on the field of battle. He had graduated medical school in 1928, years after he had begun his studies while simultaneously working to support himself and his family. Despite the difficult road he had undertaken to better himself, he excelled and was elected as vice president of his sophomore class. After his graduation, he took residency in St. Alexis Hospital in the Kingsbury Run area, married a nurse, and started a family with 2 children. The stresses eventually got the better of him, however, and he started to drink at roughly the same time he graduated. His wife stated that he drank habitually, and this eventually led to his expulsion from residency at the hospital, as well as a separation from his wife in 1934. Their divorce was granted 2 years later in 1936, and she filed a restraining order against him, concerned of his violent and abusive outbursts. Equally of interest to the police was his lifetime spent in the Kingsbury Run area, granting him intimate knowledge of the layout, that he lived in Garfield Heights, near to the locations where several of the bodies had been found, his alleged bisexuality, and the discovery that Sweeney's father had spent the final years of his life in an insane asylum after being diagnosed with psychosis. One problem with Frank Sweeney as a suspect, however, was the small fact of his cousin being Martin Sweeney, a local Democrat congressman and outspoken critic of the Republican administration. Clearly, any investigation of Sweeney needed to be discreet. Around the time the police were fishing out the limbs of victim 10 from the river, Cowles and Ness arranged for Sweeney to be followed. They searched his office and even his mail. After the drastic steps taken by Ness to burn down the shantytowns, he then went one step further and he pulled Sweeney off the streets, taking him to a room in a local hotel named the Cleveland and placed him under supervision for 14 days. When they did pick him up, he had been so drunk that the first 3 days was simply to allow him to dry out. But once sober, Ness got on with the job proper. He also arranged for Leonard Keeler, the man who invented the modern polygraph, to attend the interrogation and bring along his machine. All of this Ness managed to undertake in complete secrecy. The men grilled Sweeney for a further 11 days and tested him with the polygraph test twice, both of which he failed on key questions. According to Keeler, Sweeney was their man, which he claimed confidently to Ness. Despite Ness firmly agreeing with Keeler and convinced of Sweeney's guilt, he had no evidence to take him to court, and the doctor was likely to have been judged insane even if he had. Without any confession, which Sweeney was clearly not willing to give, he was forced to eventually let him go. Within a week of the interrogations finishing, Sweeney committed himself once again to the Veterans Hospital in Sandusky, where he lived out the rest of his days, bouncing from mental institution to mental institution until his eventual death in 1965. After the interrogation, Sweeney's mental health appears to have drastically deteriorated to the point he sent Ness postcards with cryptic and obscure messages. They are often filled out full of gibberish, and he signed them off with various names such as Paranoidal Nemesis. Whether or not Sweeney was the murderer, it is at least true that Ness must have had a fairly strong confidence in his guilt to have taken the steps to interrogate him for 14 days, locked in a hotel room. It can't be ignored that the murderers did stop around the same time too, at least if you agree that the canonical murders were the only murders. In August of 1938, a fascinating story was printed in the press concerning a homeless man named Emil Fronek. Fronek was, at the time, residing in Chicago, and he claimed that in 1934, before even the murder of the Lady of the Lake, he had been out begging a meal when a man picked him up and took him home to cook for him. He described the man as looking like a doctor, and his story went on. I was invited to sit down and my host went into another room. Soon he returned with the finest handout I was ever offered. Suddenly I began to feel sick at my stomach. I told this man about it and he said he'll get me some whiskey. He went into the other room again, but I was getting suspicious. I staggered out of the house and managed to get into an empty boxcar standing on a railroad siding not so far away. Some other men found me there 3 days later. I had been out all that time. There's no doubt that I was poisoned. And another fact which I stumbled onto later, after I began reading about all those Cleveland murders, convinced me that I might have been murdered too. I ran into another man and told him of my experience. He said, "That's funny, I almost got cut up in that house too." He said that he had begged a meal there and he was treated just as I was, and by the same man. He didn't remember anything more after the meal until he woke up in what he figured was a private hospital. He had been cut across the abdomen and was slashed down the chest. He escaped from the hospital by jumping over a back fence. Fronek later claimed that he went back to find the doctor to fix him, but he could no longer locate his house. He also stated that he didn't hold much stock in the second man's story. "He talked too crazy for me to believe him," he said. Whilst the story sounds possibly far-fetched, Fronek was picked up by the police and driven around Kingsbury Run area to look for the doctor's house, though once again he failed to recognise it. Nevertheless, it appears Ness himself believed Fronek, and also that he believed Fronek's guy to be Sweeney himself. One fact that does skew this, however, is that Fronek described the doctor in his experience as being 5'6", while Sweeney was known to be 6 foot tall. It does stand, however, as an interesting epilogue to the case, and appears to at least have some merit if we're to accept that the police and Ness both bought Fronek's tale enough to pick him up in Chicago and bring him to Cleveland. The Torso murders are a grim and savage stain on the history of Cleveland. Ness never quite recovered from the criticism he took for his burning of the shantytown, nor his failure to capture the Mad Butcher, and he left the police in 1941. It's still debated today on how many murders should be treated as canonical, and whilst most accept that victim 0, the Lady of the Lake, should be included, there are others who believe, like Detective Merlot, that the body count of the Mad Butcher lies much, much higher, linking him with over 24 murders in the Ohio and Pennsylvania areas, and linking him even to the Black Dahlia. With a murderer who had such a loose MO, and no motivations other than appearing to just enjoy chopping people up with no apparent preference to gender, age, sexuality or race, it was hugely difficult to gain any clear picture of who the murderer might have been and why he may have chosen his victims. After all these years, we can only trawl back through old records and deduce, much like Ness and Cowles, that Sweeney was the best suspect and possibly the Mad Butcher. If that's the case, then why and how did he get away with it all? even after such close interrogations from police. Some suggest deals may have been made to deflect attention from the family that led him to committing himself. Others suggest he was protected by his cousin, and there is always the possibility that he was in fact just an innocent, if somewhat troubled man with an alcohol problem. Theoretically, the case is still open, though there has been little effort to investigate further, and it's hard to see it ever being pursued after such a long, cold period. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run instead falls by the wayside, retold by few as a grisly tale of murder and mystery with no conclusion.